Hayden's in. Mackenzie. If anyone's got any DBQ questions, before we get going here, we're gonna start doing some content in about 1 minute, but I can answer any DBQ or any AP questions you might have. Also, while we're prepping, if you haven't printed off the note sheets that are right underneath the Google Meet link, that would be helpful because I'm just going to run through those sheets and then you can kind of follow along as I go through. All right, it's 1 o'clock. I'd like to see 40 people, but we'll take what we can get. What I'm going to do is in just a second, I'm going to go through a couple things I saw with DBQs and, just talk about some of the more common mistakes I've seen. I got 25 DBQs submitted. So I think I have a pretty good sample size on that DBQ. So I can, give you a little feedback on that. Also, if you did turn in a DBQ, if you go back and look at the actual DBQ, I did write comments on there. And at the bottom is the new rubric. And I told you like 1 out of 2, 2 out of 2. I played that out for you on the bottom of your paper. So there is some feedback there for you to take a look at. Also, when I'm going through the content, if you have a question on anything I'm doing, just unmic yourself and ask, okay? If we run into a situation where, like lots of people are talking, then we might have to change that protocol. But with 8 people, I don't think we're gonna run into that problem. So if you got a question, just pop in. Finally, I am recording this, and my hope is that I'm going to post this on Google Classroom afterwards. So if you got to duck out and do something else, or obviously we have a lot of people that aren't on, you'll be able to watch it later as well. So this is the first time I'm going to post a Google Meet recording. So hopefully that'll go well. It seems like it's gone well for other teachers. So if it doesn't, then we'll regroup on that. But I think it'll go good. Last thing I want to mention before I get started is there is a new DBQ out there. I say stuff like it's due on Friday. I'd like it on Friday so I can, grade it over the weekend and then give you some input back on Monday when we do our Google Meets or Tuesday. But if you don't get it into me on Friday, then, get it into me when you can. I will grade it. I will, give you credit for it, and I will give you some feedback on it. Even the first one, if you haven't done that and you turn that in, 5 days from now, I'll look at it. Once we get past, the date that a DBQ is due, so to speak, make sure you send me like an email or like a post on Google Classroom that you turned it in, because sometimes I forget to go back to like old assignments and look to see if someone turned it in. So if you do turn in something late, then just tell me and I'll go back and I'll take a look at it and give you credit for it. So that was what I wanted to go through is in regards to, the DBQ that's coming up. And as far as the DBQ that you just did, two things that I wanted to point out. Number one, in the thesis statement, the most common mistake I saw, which is not going to be a big shock to you, is people wanted to tell me all about the significance of the Protestant Reformation. And what you needed to do is talk about the social and the cultural impact. Some people didn't do either. Some people did social and no cultural. Some people did culture and no social. But those two parts, you've got to have a clear reason for social, and you've got to have a clear reason for culture before you dive into the DBQ. The other thing is, keep in mind when you're doing your support, to mention at the beginning of the paragraph, this is a social or this is a cultural reason. A lot of times, people are giving me a reason, but they don't say social or cultural, so I can't give you the full points on that. And I know that, people try to avoid POV because it can be difficult, but one thing I just want to mention about the difference in this new rubric is if you just get one POV right, you get a point. You get two POVs right, you get 2 points. So it's a little different than it was before where you had to get 3 to get the point. Now it's pretty much every POV you get a point. So, I would certainly try to take a stab at those POVs because that could be 2 points for you if you can get both, which could really help out your DBQ grade. So just keep that in mind with the DBQ. And the last thing I wanted to mention is the historical evidence. You get a point for each key fact that you bring in. So a bunch of people brought in one fact, which is great. It's like diet of worms or something like that. But if you bring in another one, you get another point on that. So keep in mind 2 historical facts and you get points for both. So that can be really helpful. So that's what I saw on the most recent DBQ. And like I said, as far as your individual DBQ, if you submitted it, there's feedback there for you. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through absolutism and constitutionalism, and I'm going to give you a brief summary of these two political systems and some of the monarchs that operated in them. Keep in mind, I'm probably going to run through this in like 30 minutes or less, and we spent weeks on this content. So this is not the end all be all of everything. I did post a whole bunch of links and extra notes on both of these topics. If you go down like 3 or 4 posts, you'll see it. And those are super helpful as well, especially, if you really are having trouble getting into the groove of studying. I think those crash course histories are fairly entertaining and are over pretty quick. So that would be my #1 recommendation on the links is the crash course. That Tom Ritchie, he's got super good content. He's a really good AP Euro teacher, but he's not a ton different than me. Where we're just sitting here talking. I think the crash course got a little bit more production to it. So keep that in mind as well. And if you've got your notes printed out where it says absolutism is where I'm going to begin today. And certainly when we're talking about absolutism, we got to begin with Charles V. Couple key things I need you to know about Charles V. Charles V is the head of the Habsburg family. The Habsburg family is going to run the Holy Roman Empire. It's the most powerful family in all of Europe. And Charles V will be the head of that family. He is going to be the Holy Roman Emperor during Luther and the Reformation and all that kind of stuff. So Charles V is a very important figure during this time period. Diet of Augsburg, Peace of Augsburg, all that kind of stuff. For today, though, as long as you know that Charles V is head of the Habsburg family, Holy Roman Emperor, you'll be fine with Charles V. Now, when Charles V begins to get older, he's done running the kingdom. It's the Holy Roman Empire. You've got Spain and Italy and American colonies and Germany and all kinds of stuff to do. So what he's going to do is he's going to divide his empire up. He's going to give half of the empire to his son, which is really where we're going to focus today. And that guy's name is Philip II. Make sure you highlight that in your notes. And Philip II will be the king of Spain. Now, Philip II is probably the most powerful monarch Spain ever has. He's got a lot of resources at his disposal. A lot of our conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, all the money they brought back. Philip has that money at his disposal to pretty much do what he wants to do. One of the things he will do is he will clear the Mediterranean of the Ottomans. That's a big step forward for Europe. He's also going to spend money on elaborate churches, the cathedral at Seville, and then his insane home, the Escorial. So he spends a lot of money on, I guess, what we might call like luxury or frivolous type items. One of the big mistakes that Philip makes is he does not allow that money to trickle down to the poor. So a lot of that money is going to stay at the top, which is going to cause massive inflation in Spain and causes all kinds of massive economic problems, which really in the end is probably the largest factor to why Spain is going to fall off the radar here as far as the most powerful nation in Europe. Now, one factor certainly is a mishandling of the economy, and in my opinion, that's the most important factor. This sometimes can be called the price revolution because you have a raising of prices in the Spanish market. So if you see that, price revolution relating to exploration, it's, that all this gold and silver is coming into Spain. So prices go up because people got more money to spend, or at least the wealthy people do. So that is Philip II. The next thing I wanted to mention in regards to Philip II is the Spanish Armada. Now, we spent a lot of time with the Spanish Armada. This is really a conflict not only between Catholicism, which is Philip, and Protestantism, which is going to be our other side of the coin, and that is England and Elizabeth. Elizabeth has recently come to power with the death of her sister Mary. Mary's the first daughter of Henry VIII and was married to Philip for a little bit. When Elizabeth comes into power, Philip will try to marry Elizabeth. She says no thank you, and she is going to strengthen Protestantism in England. This really puts her on a collision course with Philip. They get in some big disputes over what's going on in the Netherlands. Quick side note, Philip tries to convert the Netherlands to Catholicism. The Dutch don't like being told what to do. You got some massive fighting there. Pacification at Ghent, where, the Spanish go into the town of Ghent and just slaughter these poor Dutch. And then also, if you can remember Rembrandt's Night's Watch, that's when they're all kind of standing there with their weapons outside the church door. That has to do with, what's going on in the Netherlands. So that's certainly one area of tension. And then finally is the piracy in the Caribbean. Guys like Drake and Cabot and Sir Walter Raleigh, they're robbing Spanish ships, and Philip super PO'd about it. So, all of these factors play into why Philip is going to try to destroy England with the Spanish Armada. He will not be successful in doing that. The English Navy, under the leadership of Francis Drake, will destroy this Armada. And certainly, although Spain's got some other problems, this is the defining moment in where Spain begins to decline and England begins the rise. And certainly Philip's going to get a lot of credit for the decline, and Elizabeth's going to get a lot of credit for the rise in England. So we see a changing of the guard here with Elizabeth and Philip. The last thing that I want to mention about Elizabeth, a lot of what we talk about with Elizabeth is, her personal life and things of that nature, which we won't get into too much. But one thing that I want to mention is that she is going to try to strengthen the Protestant church in England. And one thing that she's going to do is she's going to pass the 39 Articles. And I need you to highlight that in your notes there. It's something that comes up from time to time. And this 39 Articles, it's super important because this lays out what the Anglican Church is going to be from this time forward. If you were with me last time, or if you watched the video last time, with Henry VIII, he is really Catholic light. He technically does become Protestant, but he's really still a Catholic. Elizabeth is going much more in the Protestant direction. Now, some radical Protestants aren't going to like her, like guys like John Knox, who's a radical Presbyterian. He don't like women to begin with, and he thinks that, she's just too light on Catholicism. Your radical Catholics aren't going to like it. They want her to go back to Catholic, the one true faith, so they're not going to like it either. But, it's designed to be a middle ground. So your radicals, Elizabeth's going to deal with that. Everyone else, we have some compromise here. So 39 Articles, very, very important. Now, the key factor with Elizabeth is she's not going to have an heir. We went into a lot of her marriage issues before. I'm not really going to do that right now, but she's not going to have an heir. So when she is going to pass away, she is going to pass power on to her nephew, actually Mary Queen of Scots' son, and the guy's name is James the First. Now, I'm not really going to have you do much with James the First. James the First is a pretty unpopular king in England. King James Bible is probably the best and most influential thing he's going to do. When he dies, his son, Charles the First, is going to become king of England. And Charles the First has got a lot more stuff for us to talk about. First off, Charles the First does not want to work with Parliament. He feels that he's above Parliament, that they're beneath him, that he shouldn't have to ask Parliament for money. So Charles and Parliament are constantly going back and forth over money, religion, all kinds of factors. Finally, Parliament gets so upset with Charles that they basically have the Magna Carta too. And on the second page there where it says, petition of rights there, make sure you highlight that. I'm not going to go through all the conditions of the petition of rights, but just know it's Magna Carta too. They're going to take more power away from the king and give it to Parliament. Charles does not like this, and this continues a feud between him and Parliament that eventually will bring in Scotland. Scotland is a Protestant section of England, and Charles wants them to follow the Book of Common Prayer. So he's going to put a guy named Archbishop Laud, and you can highlight that. It's number 2 under, Charles attempted to rule without Parliament. And he's trying to put the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland, which they don't like, and eventually will declare war on Charles because of this. When this happens, we're going to have what is called the short and long Parliament. I'm not going to go into that too much. He's going to bring Parliament in, ask them for support and money. They say no. He dismisses them. He then brings them back again. He asks for all of these same things. They say no. He dismisses them again. But this time, Parliament's not going away. Parliament's just not going to let Charles just drive the country into the ground. So what now we have is a civil war. Charles versus Parliament. Now, on Charles' end, he is going to be what is called the Cavaliers. That's going to be his army. And on Protestant end, we're going to have the Roundheads led by the very famous Oliver Cromwell. Now, the goal in the Civil War was not to kill Charles. The goal was to get him to sign the Petition of Rights, take more power away from him, throw him back on the throne, and let Parliament kind of run the show. That was the idea. However, once Charles loses the war, Cromwell is going to assume control. And one of the things that Cromwell is going to do is he is going to execute Charles I. Now, the way Cromwell pulls this off is he basically doesn't allow people that sympathize with Charles to enter into Parliament. It's called Pride's Purge or the Rump Parliament. And the reason that he does this is he wants the Parliament to vote on whether Charles is going to be killed or not. And by keeping all of Charles' sympathizers out, he knows that the vote's going to turn out his way. And it does. And Charles is going to be publicly executed. And Oliver Cromwell is going to take control of England. Oliver Cromwell will call himself Lord and Protector of England. And he is going to rule England through what we might call Puritan law. So no drinking, no smoking, no cussing, no gambling, none of that stuff is going to be allowed. During his time, we have 2 movements begin in England. One is called the Levellers. These are people that wanted universal suffrage. Everyone gets the right to vote. And also the Diggers. They wanted all people to vote and wanted all the wealth to be redistributed equally, another predecessor to communism. So these are 2 movements that kind of erupt during the time excuse me, of the English Civil War. Now, once Charles is killed, Oliver will rule until he dies, and then his son is killed, and Parliament assumes control temporarily. They feel that the country does need a king, so they're going to invite Charles's son back to England. That is Charles II. and he will return to England, and he is sometimes known as the Merry Monarch. So the monarchy has been restored, and Charles II is the guy who's going to do it. Now, Charles II is a very popular king. He is a very humorous guy. He's a very laid-back guy. And I would say that he takes care of his people well. For instance, during the Great Fire of London, Charles II's out there with a pail being a firefighter. During the Great Plague of London, he refuses to leave. So he's a very popular king. His problems with Parliament are not going to stop. He has the same problems that his dad did. However, Charles II is a little bit better at dealing with it. Now, one of the important things that's going to happen under his reign is what's called the Test Act, and I need you to highlight that. Parliament was fairly positive that Charles was a closet Catholic, which he is, and the Test Act said that no Catholic could serve as king, and that no Catholic could serve in public office. It's kind of a joke, you know. I mean, if you're a Catholic, you just lie about it. But it is something to kind of get under Charles' skin, and it was meant to do that. Another thing that I don't have down there for you, but the Popish plot is Parliament accuses Charles' wife of trying to kill him. There's absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever, and it's another attempt of Parliament just trying to get at Charles. Charles will spend the rest of his reign weakening Parliament, going after people personally, and by the time he dies, we are dealing with a fairly weak Parliament. So that's Charles II. And then we get to our last guy here, James II. That's Charles's brother. James was a very popular guy. He's a naval officer. You know, he fought in several conflicts for England. He's very popular with the people. However, his reign does not go well. And the number one reason why is James publicly comes out, says he's a Catholic, and publicly comes out and says that his son will be raised Catholic as well. Now, this puts Parliament in a situation where, you know, they can't let that happen. So what they're going to do is they're going to appeal to William of Orange, William III of the Netherlands, and his wife, Mary Stuart, who is James's daughter. And Parliament says, like, hey, if you come and invade England, we won't stop you. You know, we need a Protestant in here. We need to get James out. So William and Mary do that. They invade England. Excuse me. It's completely bloodless. James flees. I think James is just so destroyed by the people turning on him and his daughter turning on him that he doesn't really even put up a fight. And William and Mary take over. It's called the Glorious Revolution, and the reason why is it's bloodless. You know, there's no major war. You know, the king doesn't get executed or anything like that. So it's called the Glorious Revolution. Two things about the Glorious Revolution. Number one, this is going to institute a constitutional monarchy into England. And number two, William and Mary will be forced to sign the English Bill of Rights, which is going to give rights and privileges to the upper middle class, and, you know, I guess maybe we say like maybe middle class, but lower middle class poor people are not getting these rights. But the English Bill of Rights is a start. So those are a couple things that come out of the Glorious Revolution. I think now we're going to jump into Louis XIV. So if you look at your notes there where it says Louis XIV, I'll build up to that real quick. When we last talked about France, I talked about Henry IV or Henry Navarre coming out of the war, the religious wars of France, and the Bourbon family taking control. And after that happens, we get Louis XIII. Now, I'm not going to spend much time with Louis XIII. He's a drug addict. And Cardinal Richelieu is going to run France for him. Cardinal Richelieu is going to get France involved in the 30 Years' War to kind of place this in history. Louis XIII is going to die at a fairly young age due to alcohol abuse. And this is where we get Louis XIV, comes in, I think, at 5 years old, and is now going to begin running France. Couple quick things with the early part of Louis's reign. Cardinal Mazarin is going to be running things for Louis until he gets old enough. And early off in his reign, there's a revolt against Mazarin called the Fronde, which means slingshot. And this revolt was an attempt to overthrow Louis. It fails. Afterwards, the nobles say, "Hey, Louis, listen, we weren't revolting against you, man. We're revolting against Mazarin. He's a real jerk." And Louis says, "Okay, but just so you know, in the future, any revolt against my administration is a revolt against me." And he will never trust nobles again, which is a big reason why we're going to have Versailles here in just a second. When Louis does become king, he will associate himself with the sun. Excuse me, he will be referred to as the Sun King because the sun rises and sets with Louis. He also states, "I am the state." So, like I am France, France is me. This is a very different idea than what we see with like Frederick the Great later. And he's like, I'm the first servant of the state. So a very different idea on what the role of the king actually is. Louis will eventually move south of Paris to an elaborate palace complex called Versailles. Versailles is the largest palace complex in Europe at this time. And although Versailles is absolutely spectacular, what it is a golden, or sometimes referred to as a gilded cage for the nobility, in that he uses Versailles to basically imprison the nobility and have them waste their money and time trying to get influence in the court rather than trying to overthrow Louis. So people are spending their time deciding, like, trying to figure out who's going to have the privilege of waking Louis up in the morning rather than people trying to figure out how they can overthrow him. And it has a very powerful effect. Versailles is a way that Louis does manipulate his nobility. And that is something to keep in mind. Like that is a DBQ type topic where, a question can be like, what are the similarities and differences on how, monarchs controlled their nobility? And Versailles would be great. We'll get into it a little bit later on in this lecture, but like table of ranks, general directory, any of that stuff would work there. So that's a good thing to remember. Going down a little bit further, Louis is going to revoke the Edict of Nantes. This protected Huguenots against the Catholics. This was a huge mistake. I think he even knew it at the time. He told the Pope God owes him one for this, because all those Huguenots in France are now fleeing, and they're going to use all their money and power and influence to cause trouble for Louis in other countries. So it was a pretty bad move. He's also going to crush a religious hybrid between Calvinism and Catholicism called Jansenism. And that maybe could have been a great healing situation for the French, but he smashes that down too. Getting into Louis' foreign policy, we're not going to go through all of Louis' wars. Just know that John Baptiste Colbert is his finance minister and will raise money for Louis' wars through mercantilism. If you look under Louis XIV's foreign policies there, you'll have Colbert. He's the first guy there. Just keep that in mind. He's especially since the test has moved in a more economic front the last couple of years, that certainly could pop up. And the only war I'm going to mention is the War of Spanish Succession. And just quick summary, we talked about poor, unfortunate Charles II of Spain and his mental retardation and jaw deficiency and all the nightmares of that poor kid. And that Philip Anjou, Louis' nephew, is super nice to him. Charles leaves him the kingdom, and this essentially is Louis getting Spain, and England and Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire can't have that, and we're going to have a big nasty war called the War of Spanish Succession. In the end, Louis will lose. The English are victorious. The English will get the Strait of Gibraltar, which gives them control of the Mediterranean. And then also they'll have the Asiento, which gives them control of the Spanish slave trade in the New World. Philip Anjou is actually going to be put on the throne of Spain, but he has to separate himself from the French Bourbon family. So you have the Spanish Bourbons and the French Bourbons, and there can be no link, so that the French side cannot become king of Spain again. So just keep that in mind with the War of Spanish Succession. When Louis's wars are all finished, Louis leaves France in a very fragile state. They are financially bankrupt from all of these losses. They're politically isolated. They've made enemies by attacking almost every border country in Europe. And, you know, when Louis dies, France is left poor and friendless. And this is a direct lead into the French Revolution and why that's going to go down. So just know that Louis XIV is going to get the ball rolling on the French Revolution, and that you know, his foreign policy was considered to be a failure. He does not achieve anything in that regard. If you're looking at your notes at the very bottom there, there's terms and definitions, just some things that you know, I didn't go over in the lecture that maybe I want to just review real quick. So I'm going to scan them. I did Fronde, did Mazarin, did Colbert, William Laud, we did him, Cromwell, Restoration, Constitutionalism. We did all those. That's all good. All right. So now if you could, and this is where we'll end out here, if you could go to your note sheet that says Eastern monarchs, German states and the Dutch, and we'll run through that, and then I'll be done for today. And keep in mind, if you got any questions as I'm going through, just unmute yourself, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and as far as the content or like how that might apply to the test. So if you're looking at your Eastern monarchs sheet, we're going to start off with Austria. Leopold I, sometimes known Hog's Mouth or Pig Lips, is in power in Austria. He is going to essentially have to go toe-to-toe with Louis, which he is going to fare pretty well. Austria is going to lose no land to Louis XIV. One way that he has to do this is he has to ask the Prussians, the other important German state, for help, which is going to be bad for Austria overall. He allows the Prussians to call themselves an independent state, and he allows the king of Prussia to be, you know, or the leader of Prussia to be a king. And these are all things that'll bite Austria later. But for now, the Prussian-Austrian alliance is big. It does help them protect themselves from Spain. I'm sorry, from France. Leopold will also ally himself with the Polish King John Sobieski and help drive the Ottomans out of Central Europe. So that's another big thing that Leopold will get accomplished. So that's Leopold. When he dies, his heir to the throne is Charles VI. Charles VI's reign in itself is not super important for us. What is important is the concept of pragmatic sanction. Charles VI has one daughter. Her name is Maria Theresa. He has trained this girl really almost since birth to be a queen. He wants her to serve. The problem is Austria has rules against women being in charge. So the pragmatic sanction is Charles going to basically all the nobles saying, like, what do I got to do to put Maria in the queen seat today? You know, and sometimes he's paying money, sometimes he's giving land, you know, he's doing all kinds of different stuff. But eventually he will get everyone to sign this pragmatic sanction. And when he does pass, Maria Theresa is going to become the new leader of Austria, which had been unprecedented in the past. So, you know, hey, that's something you can maybe use for feminism here. You know, our first female Holy Roman Emperor, you know, that's certainly something that could be used there. When Maria Theresa comes in, she is going to make Vienna the cultural center of Europe. The Vienna Art Academy is going to become the place to study music and painting. And Austria becomes the cultural center of Europe. She is also going to work in reforming the Austrian military, which really does need some reform, but she doesn't get super far with that. A lot of the Austrian generals feel like a woman shouldn't tell them what to do, and they don't pay a lot of attention to her advice. So she's limited in what she can do as far as military modernization is concerned. The last thing I want to mention with Maria Theresa, probably her most important war is the War of Austrian Succession, where she's going to go up against Frederick. Even though she is going to lose land, specifically Silesia, in this war, the fact that that's all she loses is fairly good. You know, she's at war with France and Prussia at that point, with only England as a friend, and England never drops any soldiers. And the fact that she don't lose Hungary or any of those possessions in Italy is fairly good for Maria. So the War of Austrian Succession, she does lose Silesia, so I guess we'd have to call it a loss, but it could have been much, much worse. So Maria Theresa, in Austria, that's key to remember. Going down, we were talking about Prussia. The royal family that will be running Prussia is the Hohenzollern family. And the Hohenzollern family, we're going to begin with Frederick William, the Great Elector. Now, Frederick William is one of the guys that elects the Holy Roman Emperor. He is not a king. That is why he does not have a number in front of his name. Frederick William will do some important things, though. He will upgrade the Prussian military into the fighting force that it's going to become. And then Frederick William is also going to stabilize the Prussian economy during this time period and make it a much more stable state. Now, when Frederick dies, his son, Frederick I, comes into power. Frederick I will give his army to Leopold to fight Louis, which we just talked about. And as a reward for that, Frederick is going to be able to call himself king, which is why he gets the little number. After Frederick dies, we get Frederick William I. All right, once again, he's got the little number because he's a king. Besides being a bizarre freak that collects tall people, Frederick William is going to further modernize the Prussian army to one of the greatest armies ever. And he will also set up what is known as the General Directory, which will reorganize his nobility into the military system and give Frederick William a lot more control over his nobles. So General Directory, that could go great with the Versailles situation with Louis, so just keep that in mind. Lastly, we've got Frederick II or Frederick the Great. We'll come back to Frederick the Great when we do the Enlightenment and Enlightened despots. He's the greatest of all the Prussian leaders. Not only is he going to win the War of Austrian Succession, he's also going to win the 7 Years' War, which we'll spend some time with later. And he is going to be considered an enlightened despot. He's having dinner with Voltaire and, writing poetry. I think he played like 6 or 7 different musical instruments. So, he is as far as culture and intelligence, certainly the best that the Prussians will produce. And maybe best battlefield commander as well. So that's Frederick II or Frederick the Great. And, I think, that's all we're going to do with that. I'm going to move on to Russia now. So if you flip over there, you'll see Russia. Real quick with Russia, Russia's kind of behind the curve. They've been fighting the Mongolian horde for some time now, and they missed out on the Renaissance because of that. So Russia's a very backwards people at this point. And things will start to change under Ivan IV or Ivan the Terrible. He's an absolute nutjob, but he will stabilize Russia and actually, push the Mongolians further out of that territory, which allows Russia to kind of regroup as a country. After Ivan dies, we have what's called the Time of Troubles. Lots of fighting in Russia to see who comes to power. The family that will win is the Romanov family. It will begin with Michael Romanov, and it'll end with Nicholas II Romanov during the World War I and the Communist Revolution. So the Romanovs will run things for a little over 300 years after the death of Ivan and the Time of Troubles. Certainly, you can go through a lot of Romanovs, but we're going to start with Peter the Great, so make sure you highlight him. Without getting into all the personal stories of Peter's height and drinking binges and, insane intelligence, Peter wants to modernize Russia. And, I've talked before about Russia having an identity crisis. In Peter's mind, there's no identity crisis. Russia's European. That's what we are. And he will do a 6 or 7 month tour of Europe where he goes through and, basically grabs the Renaissance, medicine, painting, astronomy, shipbuilding, and brings it back to Russia, sets up schools and says, all right, we're stupid. Let's pick this up. So he will westernize Russia. He will bring the Renaissance to Russia, which is certainly his most famous feat. Peter, like a lot of kings, also has trouble with his nobility. You've got the Streltsy and the Moscow Guard and, all kinds of issues for Peter. One of the ways he will control this is the table of ranks, where he ranks the nobles on how effective he thinks they are for the monarch. So it doesn't matter who your daddy was, doesn't matter how much land you have, your rank in Russia is how the king feels you have served him. And that's the table of ranks. So again, General Directory, Versailles, table of ranks, those are all good ways on how to manipulate the nobility. Now, the last thing I want to mention about Peter is he is going to build a city called St. Petersburg, which he called his window to the west. Moscow is a long way from Europe, boy, and he wanted a closer, more direct path to Europe. So St. Petersburg being on the Baltic there, he can just take boats to Europe, which speeds things up incredibly. In order to do this, Peter has got to fight a war because he don't own that land. The Swedes do. It's known as the Great Northern War. It's Peter and the Russians versus Charles the 12th and the Swedes. Charles the 12th is the first to make the classic Russian mistake of chasing Peter into Russia during the Russian winter, and Charles is smashed. You know, you'd think Napoleon and Hitler would have learned from that. Neither did. But, you know, Charles, at least I'll give him some credit. He's the first to do it. And, you know, even though he should have won, he loses. And this gives Peter that coastal land for St. Petersburg. So that's Peter the Great. I did Great Northern War. I just talked about Charles the 12th, so we're not going to do that. Where it says United Provinces, the Dutch Republic. As far as the Dutch go, okay, there's a couple key things. First off, know that the Dutch are very tolerant people, which I think I've hit that point home pretty hard over these last couple of months, that as far as religious and political and social norms, you know, the Dutch are like, whatever. So that is an important part of their culture. The other thing that I need you to understand about the Dutch is they become the commercial center of Europe. Amsterdam specifically, commercial center of the world during this time period of the 1600s. Because of this, the Dutch dominate banking and trade, and this is certainly the high point of the Dutch Republic. The stadtholder is the, I guess you could say, the executive of the Netherlands. You could call him king, but he'd be the weakest king you could possibly come up with. You know, the Dutch king does not have much power. And the legislative branch of the government is called the States General. And they are making most of the decisions in the Netherlands. And the stadtholder versus the States General is a constant battle on who's going to have power. And the States General is typically the victor. The other thing that I want to mention real quickly in regards to the Netherlands is tulip mania. Real quick, the Dutch, you know, being in banking and investment and speculation, feel that there's some big money to be made in tulips, which is this new exotic flower that just showed up into Europe. They way overinvest in these tulips. They pay outrageous prices for these tulips. The market eventually bottoms out. Everyone realizes, oh my God, I just paid $3 million for a tulip. And the Dutch economy will crash temporarily because of this, but it will crash. Tulip mania in itself, you know, certainly we've got the buyer beware, you know, make sure that, you know, whatever you're investing in has real value. But then also we have the fact that, like, people begin to lose their faith in the Dutch economy because of it. Like, do I really want to put my money in a bank where people are paying $2 million for flowers? So, you know, this really hurt the Dutch overall because, you know, French and Spanish and other investors are starting to put their money in England over the Netherlands. So keep that in mind with tulip mania. We did Sweden. So we'll wrap up here with Poland. I really did Poland too, but I'll wrap up real quick. Poland sits between Russia and what is Germany or Holy Roman Empire at this time. And, you know, Poland is going to make a lot of mistakes. The main problem is their nobility, the Sejm. They can't agree on anything, and that includes who should be king. So if they have a king, they don't support the king. If they don't have a king, often they go to foreigners to be king, so they don't have to pick a Polish person. And it really hurts Poland. One guy that could have maybe pulled Poland out of this is King John Sobieski. He is going to drive the Ottomans out of Central Europe with the help of the Austrians, specifically Leopold. But he gets no support from the Shisham. They allow him to do nothing as a monarch, and all of that is wasted for Poland. And eventually, which we'll talk about at a later date, but eventually Poland will be attacked by Russia, Germany, and Austria, and split apart and destroyed. So, you know, Poland's heading down to the road of extinction here because of the Shisham and the mishandling of their government. Let me see here. I'm just going to go through any terms on here. Oh, Junkers are Prussian nobility. Forgot about that one. Boyars are Russian nobility. And I think that's really it. I can't really see anything else that is going to show up on that. So that is absolutism and constitutionalism. Does anybody have any questions on any of the stuff that we just went over? Okay. Well, I really appreciate you showing up. You know, last time we did it, people said they like the live way better than me on YouTube, which I'm happy to do the live if people like that better. It doesn't seem like people really want to interact with me, but that's fine. I'm thinking about doing another one on Friday. So, you know, I should be probably today or tomorrow, I'll be posting what I think is going to be scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is our next unit to go through. So on Friday, I'll do some review on scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and I'll answer any questions you have on the most recent DBQ, which is on the Enlightenment. So, you know, if you got any questions on that, I can answer that for you as well. So if you don't have anything else for me, feel free to go do whatever you're going to do. All right. And thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate it.